But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about doubt in particular as one of life's challenges. And we always think about Thomas. In fact, he got the nickname, didn't he? Doubting Thomas. Maybe we'll question that a little bit tonight and see to what extent that's true, maybe to what extent it isn't. But I think it's a relevant topic, especially for younger folks, maybe who are still trying to establish their faith, understand the world maybe a little bit better. And to help me out, and this is somewhat of an unstructured beginning, a little bit of risk, but I think y'all will help me. I want you to think of somebody, or maybe your own self, who really went through a period of doubt in their life, and maybe with a bad result. Maybe they fell away in some way. And I don't mean they doubted whether they'd be on time to the services. I mean on some significant issue, right? Like maybe whether Jesus was really the Son of God, or whether he really was resurrected, or whether the Bible's really inspired. You know what I'm talking about? Or there's just one way and the scriptures are authoritative. The kinds of doubts that really put in question the fundamental elements of our faith. Have you got somebody in your mind? I see some nods. That doesn't mean I'm going to call on you, but I will ask for volunteers to. And so this is a little bit unstructured. This is the first question I want to ask. What else was going on in their life at the time they were having those doubts? Was it just a theological wrestling, an intellectual wrestling with things? Thank you for nodding. This is such a signal to me. That's the answer I was hoping for, by the way. So why don't you explain? Very short answer, but what else was going on in their life?
Parental problems.
Okay.
Strifeful marriage with both the parents, strifeful marriage, and kind of loss of respect for authority figures in his life.
Right. Anybody else have a similar situation where, but yet you ask them, they say, well, I'm having doubts about my faith. And you almost want to say, well, what's the rest of the story? You know what I mean? You all know what I'm talking about? You maybe have wrestled with that with yourself about that. And I want to talk about that because I think in many ways you could look at Thomas and the events surrounding the crucifixion. I can't hardly imagine. I don't even want to see a car accident where somebody's hurt. You know how traumatic that is? You see a body laid out beside the car. Do you know what happened at the crucifixion to a man's body? And the cruelty and everything that was associated with that, and the injustice, especially from someone who loved the master and had been with him for years. You understand what a trauma that would be in life? What happened to the disciples during that? So my point would be, to talk about doubt only as an intellectual exercise is probably not the whole story. Do you agree with that? Can you get to go with me on that? And so let's keep that in mind, but let's just talk about it. I want to talk about faith and doubt. Just about how they relate to each other and what doubt is really about. And then we'll look particularly at Thomas. We learn a little bit about Thomas. 3 times he speaks in John's gospel, John's account. I think we can learn a little bit from the first 2 that will help us understand the 3rd time, which is what we'll talk about tonight. I want to also, both in defense of Thomas and in accusation of Thomas, I want to look at what was going on around that time. You know what I'm talking about? I think in some ways we can understand why he would have struggled with the idea of someone bodily raising from the dead after having been tortured and stabbed and all the things that happened to Jesus. On the other hand, a lot of stuff was going on that he could have reasoned about and maybe come to a different conclusion. So let's look at that. And then, of course, the last thing would be, let's look at what he did right and let's look at what he did wrong. Will you all go with me on this story here about Thomas and doubt? Thank you for being here, and I know you didn't invite me, so I can't say thanks for inviting me. But thanks for sitting through this in advance, right? So we'll do the best we can. You know, in our culture, someone who has doubts about something is kind of almost respected. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? They're open-minded, right? They're not dogmatic. And someone who has a firm conviction, it's very difficult to shake them off of that. They're often seen as prejudiced or bigoted in some way. You know what I'm talking about? And that's because our culture doesn't really like the idea of absolute truth, or somebody being right and somebody being wrong, and somebody holding fast to a conviction despite, on occasion, a little bit of evidence that might even contradict that, but they hold steady to what they believe, and they don't doubt. But I just want you to know about doubt in the Bible, that doubt is not desirable. You're probably familiar with this passage in James, that he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. You ever been out on a lake, or maybe the ocean's a better example, deep sea fishing, and the water kicks up. And it's up and down and up and down. How comfortable are you in that? Yeah, I just want to get off. And you feel somewhat in danger, insecure really, because is this going to flip over? What's going to happen? And I picture someone who's truly in doubt about something as fundamental as what happens to me when I die. Or is Jesus really the Son of God? Or is the Bible that I've spent my life obeying, is it really true? If I'm doubting that, do you understand? I ought to feel pretty seasick. Because these are fundamental things that I've built my life around, and others have too. You see what I'm getting at? And Ephesians 4 uses the same imagery to talk about children who lack the maturity to hold on to a conviction despite some, counter evidence that pops up here and there, and, something I can't explain, or I don't understand how the animals got on the ark, or some fact like that somehow. And so I'm easily knocked around. I'm vulnerable, okay? So rather than being, say, open-minded, if I'm doubting, you see that I'm susceptible to deception and to what people might tell me because I don't have a firm grip on something that I believe and the evidence behind it. It's not a good thing. And I think the first lesson we might take away is that if you are struggling with doubt, you ought to think of it as a sickness that you need to get over. One way or the other, resolve that issue. It's not a pleasant situation to be in. But you may be. And I think in general, in life, doubts come as challenges to our faith. And we come out of them, if we resolve them in the right way, stronger as a result of that. A few more things about doubt is that it really finds itself, in some ways, I wouldn't say the opposite, but it finds itself in tension with faith. And that is, I may have a firm faith in something, and I think about a jury trial, right? I mean, we actually condemn people to life in prison, not so much death penalty anymore, but based on evidence. Does that mean all the evidence, every single witness, every single fact pointed to their guilt? Or does it mean that beyond the shadow of a doubt, or the majority of the evidence, or whatever? So always in our faith, there will always be things we can't explain and can't understand. Did the disciples face things that Jesus said that kind of didn't make sense at the time? Or they didn't want to accept? It didn't seem consistent with their view of the Messiah or the coming kingdom that was prophesied in the Old Testament. So we always have this kind of doubt. The problem begins when that doubt begins to grow. And when it does, you see it's displacing our faith. Our faith is shrinking, right? And so we have to work on our faith. And by the way, we're commanded to believe. It's not something that just happens to some people and not others. It's something we act on. We work at, we strengthen in the same way that we might strengthen our body, working our muscles out and so on. So the first thing I would point out is that these are in tension. In this case where they were in the boat, speaking of being seasick, they were tossed by the waves and they said, "Don't you even care, we're about to die?" And there's something not too logical about that. Who's in the boat with them? I don't think, But, and had they ever seen Jesus do any miracles before? Yes, they had. Now, unfortunately, in these emotional situations, like we talked about often when doubts arise, we don't stop and think about logically what's going on. We react emotionally. I think in the boat there, they think we're just dying. We're going to die. He doesn't care. He's just asleep. And so when Jesus finally wakes up, look what he says. He says, "Where is your faith?" They were afraid. And they marveled, saying, "Who can this be? For he commands even the winds." So they had a faith, but it kind of disappeared. They couldn't find it. Couldn't pull it out at the moment they needed it, really, and make the logical argument that, well, we probably won't die with the master in the boat with us. You remember when Peter tried to walk on the water, and he got sight of the winds and the waves, lost sight of Jesus. That red doubt starts coming over on top of him. And Jesus says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" You see, those two things are in tension with one another. And as Jesus came down the Mount of Transfiguration, and there's this great tumult of people, disciples who failed to be able to cast a demon out of that young boy, Jesus said to the Father, "If you believe, I can cast it out." And he says, "Yes, I believe, but help my unbelief." And that's kind of a famous passage, where you just see that unbelief and belief are always in tension, in conflict in our lives. I believe that's because God made us as free will agents. And if we never had a doubt, never had to overcome, never had to think it through, never had to make a decision, and we never were tempted to think otherwise, I don't think we'd really actually have a free will. I think we'd just be doing what God wanted us to do. And so he's given us this as an exercise. And not only that, I think it's true that faith enables us to do great things. Move mountains is what Jesus said, right? Nothing's not possible. But when doubt begins to shrink our faith, then our ability to do actions, to respond correctly, to withstand things has to shrink as well. So what happens is, as my doubt begins to shrink my faith down, then the actions that result are just puny. They're inadequate. It won't be sufficient. But you get the idea there. So that's my little discussion about faith and doubt. And I'd like to think of them as, in some ways, in tension. Not exactly opposites, but at least one displacing the other. Let's talk about Thomas for a minute. You probably remember these accounts. They're from the Gospel of John only. And they actually start, the first one is probably 2 to 3 months before Jesus is crucified. And you remember, again, in John's account only, word came across the Jordan over on the eastern side where Jesus was, probably staying away from Jerusalem because of the threats. The word came that Lazarus was sick, really sick. Please come. Remember, Mary and Martha both said if he'd been here, he wouldn't have died, but he didn't go. Jesus didn't go, and he delayed. And he said some kind of cryptic things like, well, he's just sleeping or whatever. Finally, he says, let's go. And so he said plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I'm glad for your sakes I wasn't there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. Now understand the circumstances. Every time Jesus had been in Jerusalem, and more as his ministry progressed, there was hostility and threats of death. Really beginning, somewhat really in John chapter 5 with the healing of the lame man. But he says, let's go. Now Thomas speaks. We get to hear Thomas. Then Thomas, who is called the twin. I'm going to just stop here for a second. You know the word Thomas is probably Aramaic, maybe some suggest a Chaldean root, Toam or Toma or something like that, which means, are you ready? Twin. It means twin. And who is called Didymus. So you may have the old King James or one of the other versions that instead of putting the twin, says Didymus. Well, that's what actually the text says. But if you want to translate it into English, you put the twin. That's because Didymus means the twin, right? It means a kind of double. So Thomas, who is called the twin, those just mean the same thing. Said to his fellow disciples, now I'm sorry, that was a parenthesis. Let's go back to the context. That doesn't seem like a smart move to go into Jerusalem under the threats that Jesus had faced, does it? I mean, really. But Thomas says this, let us also go that we may die with him. I'm going to open this up just for, what do you see in Thomas's personality in that comment right there? Any thoughts?
Conviction.
Okay. You know what? He wasn't afraid to go. I think he was loyal to Jesus. Don't you see that in there? Right? Now, was Jesus going to be killed when he went back to raise Lazarus? We know now that he was safe. It was later. Although it made quite a stir and apparently even led to some of the folks who showed up at the triumphal entry, right, who wanted to see both Lazarus and Jesus. But what else do you see in that statement besides that kind of deep loyalty and conviction? I think we have to say that about Thomas.
Impulsiveness.
Okay, he just drew the conclusion right away, didn't he? And again, it's a little bit like the disciples in the boat, isn't it? Are we going to die? Well, I don't know. He said, well, let's go and die with him because we know he's going to die if he goes back. You see what I mean? So he drew that conclusion. Do you think Thomas sounds like an optimist or a pessimist?
A realist.
Okay, let's see. Yeah. So I say realist. Some people would say pessimist, right? And that's because some of us are glass half empty, glass half full people. You know what I'm talking about. Which do you think Thomas was? He's a half empty guy or a half full guy? Yeah, half empty. Well, the glass really is half empty, isn't it? So he was right,
Hey, Marty, can you check to make sure your microphone's real quick? Okay.
It was not on.
Okay, good.
Do I need to start over?
No.
So, yeah, realist, pessimist, convicted though, right? Literalist in many ways, I think. Okay, another time is in John 14, and you remember this passage. Right at the end of chapter 13, Jesus says something about where I'm going away, and you can't follow me, but soon you will follow me. And Peter says, "I'll follow you anywhere, even to death." You know, and you're then the prophecy of the denials and all that. Anyway, chapter 4 begins. Beautiful passage. We read this at funerals, you know. I mean, we read it whenever we're in trouble. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. Beautiful text, right? And he goes on to say, I go to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And where I go, you know, and the way you know. I wonder if it's as beautiful in Greek or maybe even Aramaic as it is in English. Don't you think that's a beautiful passage? What's Thomas thinking this whole time? What's that? What are you talking about? And I'm just imagining somehow the spell of this poetic language is broken. Thomas says, Lord, we don't know where you're going, and how can we know the way? Right? I mean, I think this follows in the context of Peter's discussion too, and what Jesus has said before. And Jesus is intending to comfort his disciples, I think. But what Thomas is going, and he has, you know, the initiative and the gumption and the curiosity and other things, just to say, wait a minute, wait, stop. And Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So a couple of instances where we see Thomas, maybe his personality. He's not afraid to speak up, but he wants answers. He wants them clear, and so on. Now let's turn and look at the disciples now on that Sunday morning or Sunday night or Saturday night, depending on how you figure out the time on that, when Jesus appeared. What all had happened on that first day of the week, starting early morning, when those ladies were coming to the tomb to take care of the body of Jesus? So Mary ran to the tomb. This is from John 20. The chapter opens with that. Interesting, John's language there says the stone, I believe it's in the first verse, I can't remember. The stone was removed. Some have said that, even though I think in Luke's account it talks about the stone was rolled away, but the removing may suggest that that stone was in a place a little bit out of the ordinary, like the grave clothes ended up being, right? That it wasn't just kind of pushed away, that it was gone or pushed out in an unnatural way. Anyway, they get there to the tomb, and so she sees that it's empty, or sees the stone there, and she ran to Simon Peter and to the other disciples whom Jesus loved and said to them, they've taken away the Lord out of the tomb. I'm glad she said they. Y'all know, you always talk about they say. You know who that is? I don't know who they is. I'm not sure she knew who they were, but anyway, they've taken him, whoever they is. And anyway, they've taken away the Lord out of the tomb. We do not know where they have laid him. What possibility did not enter her mind? That he was raised, right? 3 times she says the same thing. One, the last time, to Jesus himself. Where have you put him? You know, she finally found they, I guess, and thought she would get an answer there. Mary saw, now, so they come, Peter and John they look in the tomb. Again, resurrection finally dawns on John, it seems like, maybe in his head, he records this later. Mary saw 2 angels. She comes back in white, sitting, one at the head, the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain, and they said to her, woman, why are you weeping? If you jump to Luke chapter 24, they go on to say, why do you seek the living among the dead? Right? He's risen, they said. And despite that angel being there and saying that, you know what was her action? What was her response? There they are again. They've taken away my Lord. I don't know where they've laid him. Despite all that. And finally she turns, and perhaps the angels look up. I think maybe it makes her turn around and look behind her, and then she sees this person there, and supposing it was the gardener, what does she say to him? Where have you carried him? So it just seems to me that her ability to grasp, believe, jump to the conclusion that Jesus had bodily raised from the dead is not there. And we could maybe condemn Thomas for not jumping back. Mary's seen some pretty direct evidence with her own eyes and has not accepted that. Okay, let's keep going. And then it says they went and reported this to the apostles. Eyewitnesses, are they? Has Mary seen Jesus now? Yes, called her name. She knew his voice apparently when he says Miriam, or however you say her name in Hebrew. Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the other, they told these things to the apostles. And how did the apostles take that idea of a resurrection? Crazy women, just crazy women, right? They weren't really ready to accept that either. And then Simon and John, they come to the tomb and go into there, and they see the linen cloths. And I think the evidence perhaps suggested there is, this is a little speculation, but you know, when you wrap a body, dead body, you'd probably just wrap it around and around. Maybe you'd roll it over. And then when you get to the tomb and the body's not there, if a person had somehow been stolen, and how would you get the wrappings off? You just pull them off, almost like a toilet paper roll. Or maybe the person came to life, they'd fight their way out of those things. But it looks as if they're all just folded, still in maybe in the spiral and the, you know what I mean, as if the body had somehow come out of the cloth. And so there's some evidence in that John looks at, he says, whoa, wait a minute. And so John's beginning to understand, although he didn't really understand yet the words of the prophecy, both Old Testament and I think what Jesus had been telling, you know, especially through the last 6 to 9 months of the thing. But anyway, they still are kind of not dawning on it. Then there's the road to Emmaus. And I think around this time, Jesus also appeared to Peter privately. And when these people get back, Cleopas and whoever the other guy was, get back and report this to the apostles, they say, oh, guess what? And Peter saw him while y'all were gone. So there's kind of a, not simultaneous, but coincidental appearances there. And anyway, Jesus joins them, but they don't know it's Jesus. And what he says, what kind of conversation is it you have with one another as you walk? And if you read the American Standard, and there is an alternate text reading that seems has a good bit of evidence, that says, and they stood still and were sad. If you go look at the older translations, you'll see that. What was the mood of these disciples generally? This is Cleopas, whom we know nothing else about, but they'd been in Jerusalem through the whole thing. And listen to this. They said, well, it's the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet. He was mighty indeed in word and before God and the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. We were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Implication, where's that hope now? Gone. Great disappointment. And so they're sad. All these things they had seen coming to fruition, gone, crushed, right? In the violence of the crucifixion. And they were standing still and were sad when they thought about it. You see that? This is the emotional state of the disciples. Keep on going. And finally, Jesus reveals himself and he says, slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. You know, we can start to condemn Thomas for being so slow to believe, but he wasn't the only one. Do you see that? These are people with kind of very direct evidence of the tomb, of the cloth, of this man that walked with them on the road, explaining to them out of the whole Old Testament that this is what the Messiah was supposed to do, was to be crucified, right? All right. So you see Thomas is living kind of among people who were pretty sad, pretty crushed in their hopes, pretty reluctant to believe themselves despite some pretty direct evidence. So let's don't be too hard on Thomas, right? When we find out that Jesus appears to the apostles when he's not with them. All right, so we have a little sympathy for him. The same day, now I believe this is that long first day of the week and all those appearances to Mary at the tomb. Peter and John go to the tomb, private appearance to Peter, 2 men on the road to Emmaus. But the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, see their mood there, frightened, hiding. Jesus came and stood in the midst and said to them, peace be with you. Now, you know, shalom is the common Hebrew greeting. And I don't want to over-casualize it, but I think he's saying, hi, guys. Hello. It's a normal greeting. Maybe there's some theological import, but I think he's just saying hi. Look, I'm here. When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side, and the disciples were glad. Now they were sad, now they're glad. Their mood has changed. So Jesus said to them again, peace to you, and as the Father sent me, I also send you. This is perhaps John's version of the Great Commission, right? I'm sending you out. In fact, what I'm sending you out to do, as Luke says, is to preach the remission of sins, right? He talks about that. He said this, he breathed on them, he said, receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. So quite an instance of an appearance. Comes in the room without using the door, I think, and says hi. And he shows them all the physical evidence that his body is real. And he gives them some instructions about here's what's going to happen. He gives them the Holy Spirit. And so he actually does some things for their benefit. But you know what happened. You know who wasn't there. And Thomas, called the twin. I like John has some titles for people that he just seems to use over and over. And I don't know if he's jabbing you in the side, but Nicodemus, y'all know who that is? Who came to Jesus by night. He says that more than once, throughout the account. And the disciple whom Jesus loved, But again, John, the author here, says Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them. And the other disciples therefore said, now in the Greek, that's a past imperfect, which means, or present imperfect, which means they didn't finish, right? It wasn't like they said and stopped talking. They kept saying is the idea, the concept of that tense in the Greek. They were saying to him, we've seen the Lord. And he would say, no, we've seen the Lord. They were persistent. It seemed like it's what's implied in that verse. And so, we should pause and say, here's what Thomas should have been thinking about. Is there mounting evidence now that Thomas would be aware of? Well, we have the voices of the women and what they had seen at the tomb. We have Peter and John at the tomb. They, by the way, also had message of angels. Peter and John were at the tomb. They were there to testify among those 10 who were trying to tell him that they have seen the Lord. The appearance to Mary Magdalene, whom they thought was just a silly woman at the time, but that's evidence that's there. The appearance to Peter, we mentioned. The appearance on the road to Emmaus, which they had come back and reported earlier that day. And then the appearance to the 10, which we just read about in John chapter 20. All right. Did Thomas believe them? Now, we talked about belief and doubt being in tension. Does that mean Thomas's doubts were overwhelming his faith? You know he believed something about Jesus, right? Messiah, but did he believe in the resurrection? I don't think so. He said he didn't. I will in no wise believe, he said, until he gave the conditions. You see that. His doubt was overcoming his faith. Were these reasonable doubts? That a person who could be beat up and stabbed and nailed to a cross and hung there and would, after he died, come back to life again? And come back to life in such a way that he could be on the road to Emmaus and then in the room. Y'all don't have any trouble believing that, do you? I thought about illustrating this. So, y'all probably know my wife died, 8 years ago. And what if I came in here and told you, my sons and I were out at the cemetery. And we went to the place, we always go there kind of, a certain time of year. And she appeared to us. She did. She appeared. It was unmistakable. It's her voice, everything. Now, if you go, I don't know if she's still there or not. I can't bring her here to show you. You know what I mean? I don't know if you go back out there if she'll come back again. How are you guys doing in believing this story? Right? And I know it's not the same, and there were prophecies and other things. I'm just saying this is not an unreasonable piece of doubt, but it has grown to overwhelm the possibility that Thomas would believe the evidence is presented by these witnesses. You see that? This is my green, was that blue? Blue and red diagram there. So here's some things Thomas didn't do, and I'm going to give him a lot of credit for this. But I want you to think about cases that you know of where people have been overwhelmed by their doubts, whatever the other circumstances were. It's easy for us to ignore the issue. It amazes me that someone will will stop coming to services, or maybe will just come but never say anything for months on end, and you finally ask them, and they say, well, yeah, I'm having some doubts. What? And you're just now mentioning it? What are you doing about that? Are you seasick? What's going on? Well, I don't know. I'm just, did Thomas ignore the issue at all? He hardly could, really. In fact, he was kind of in a tough spot. Where he wasn't going to get along with the apostles very well, right? Because he didn't believe them. I don't think they appreciated that. I wouldn't think I would. On the other hand, he couldn't go back to the enemies of Jesus. In some ways, he was kind of caught in the middle. He couldn't ignore the issue. I think when we have doubts, we need to think about our seasick state. Whose side are we on? As Elijah said on Mount Carmel, why do you go limping between two options? Right? This has got to be uncomfortable and not really making decisions. If God is God, then worship Him. If Baal is God, then that's your decision. Make one. But we find it so easy to ignore the issue, to go along. That doesn't mean Anyway, you get that. He didn't ignore it. I'm not sure he could have anyway. Another easy thing he could be is say, here, look, we've seen him. He appeared. Yeah, you guys. Yeah, you always got it right, don't you? Right? A few days ago, you're all fired up about, and then a day ago, you were all down in the dumps. Right? Where are you? You're just inconsistent. And by the way, how many of you guys stuck around when Jesus was being arrested and crucified? Does that speak highly of your character as witnesses to all this? You understand what? And Peter, yeah, you always tell the right things, don't you? You never say anything that's not true. You see what I'm saying? Easy to attack these folks, but he didn't do that. That really wasn't part of the issue. Does that ever happen in our lives? When I'm having doubts and I say, well, you know what, though, old brother, so-and-so, I'm just so sick of the hypocrites in the church, right? Or I was at the church one time and they wouldn't let me teach any classes. And I'm never going back to that place again. What? That's almost irrelevant. You see what I mean? And Thomas had some grounds for that, but he didn't take advantage of that. He did not recall the difficult teachings of Jesus. Well, you know what? He never did tell us where he was going and how to get there. Right? And I think it's so easy for us when we're having doubts to pull up, well, what about the Gospel of Thomas? Speaking of Thomas, what do we do about that? Is it real? Some people think it's real. And I begin throwing irrelevant issues in the air, or maybe difficult passages that I still don't understand. Do you think there are a few passages that the disciples did not understand at this point? I think a lot. And Jesus had promised that later he would help them, bring to their remembrance, and guide them into all truth. He had said that the night before his crucifixion. But that's an easy thing to do. And that is, here's the heart of the issue. You believe in God and the authority of the Scripture and what the Bible teaches, or are you going to invent some kind of irrelevant issue here to distract attention? Thomas didn't do that. And he didn't allow his doubts to cause him to abandon his discipleship. It's interesting, where was he the next first day of the week? He left those guys. They're nuts, right? No, he was still with them. He was still struggling with his discipleship. I think it's because he wanted to know. He wanted to resolve the issue. How often is it the case when we think we're having doubts for whatever reason, we kind of withdraw from association with others, especially those who might answer some of our questions, who would be a resource, who might call us into account to ask us if we really believe or not. You see what I mean? Thomas didn't do that. He was still there, right there with them, doing the best he could to learn in that group. By the way, you probably have heard, I've heard a whole sermon on why you should come to Sunday night services. Y'all have Sunday night services? See, so y'all are off the hook, I guess, on that. Because, what if Thomas had not been there for that Sunday night service? The sermon I heard on that was a guest speaker on a Sunday night. So I don't know if that's... Anyway, so he didn't do that. All right, so we read this, and the other disciples said they've seen it. What did he do? Well, he said this, unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, put my finger in the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. That's what he said. What do we make of that? What do we make of that? Does he say, I'm not going to believe under any circumstances? No, he actually gives the circumstance that he might believe under, right? I think that his conditions are probably a little too restrictive. This is Marty's opinion. I wish he had said, I would believe if I could see the prints in his side, but he doesn't say that. He says, I'm not going to believe unless I get this particular piece of evidence. You see what I mean? And later Jesus will say, but there's some other people that are not going to get that evidence, and yet they'll believe. right? So he's a little bit restrictive, but at least he sets down the conditions under which his doubts would be removed, and his faith would then overcome his doubts. That's what he says there. So let's talk about some things Thomas did right, and I hope you're making application to the crisis, the challenge of doubt in our lives. When either through emotion or life circumstance or confusion or crowd pressure or crisis or tragedy or whatever it is, we're led to question God, question our belief in God, whether Jesus cares or not, whether there is life after this, what is really required to have our sins taken away. All those things that are fundamental. When we face those, here are some things that Thomas did right I hope we can apply. He realized it was important to resolve his doubts. I think that's why he was back with them that next first day of the week. He clearly identified, look, if this happens, I will believe. It's interesting when Jesus comes back, he says, Thomas, you should have believed based on all the evidence that you had up to that point. You shouldn't require this. He didn't say any of that. He just said, Thomas, I heard you, even though you didn't know I could hear you. Here's what you want. You want to see these things. And he didn't condemn him for that. And he put himself in a position to find the truth. And here's the Sunday night attendance part of the lesson, right? No, it really is puzzling to me. Not puzzling, I think I understand it, but disappointing to me that people who are struggling with doubts tend to fade away instead of spending more time in places where they can get answers. Isn't that your experience too? It's definitely mine. So after 8 days, the disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace to you. And he said to Thomas, reach your finger here, look at my hands, reach your hand here, put it in my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing. So he kind of got what he wanted, didn't he? And that leads me to one other thing I think Thomas did right. Thomas answered and said, my Lord and my God. And Jesus said, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. And we'll finish that verse in a minute. Do you think Thomas had thought through what he would do if Jesus really did appear and show him the scars in his hands and his side? Do you think he thought about that during that week in between? I kind of think he had. I think he knew exactly. Because think about it. Okay, they keep saying he's risen. It could be. I just don't believe it yet. I just don't believe it. I have too many doubts. I think the import of, by the way, the scars in the side, it might be this. Thomas was actually saying, guys, don't you remember how brutally beat up his body was? So seeing the hole, he might have been kind of subtly reminding them, he wasn't in much of a shape to come back to life again. Maybe. I don't know. But he puts those conditions down. But do you think he thought about through the week, if Jesus really is risen from the dead after what he went through and was able to do and say the things that he said when those guys were talking with him last Sunday night, what does that mean? What would it say? What's the significance of that? About his power, about his approval of God the Father, about the claims that he made. Do you understand? Do you think it's possible Thomas had been thinking through, well, if he isn't risen, then this. If he is, though, what does that mean? I'm reading a little too much, and I can tell by the looks on your face I'm stretching this a little bit. I think Thomas wrestled with that for all week long. And maybe he thought it would be a long time before he would know. But he's saying, if it's true, the consequences are eternal. Do we see our doubts in that light, of that significance? He thought it through, but he was ready. And he says, my Lord and my God. And, to a Jew, to call someone in kind of physical form, my God, is, boy, that's huge. The Shema says, the Lord, is one, right? And so to call not Son of God, not prophet from God, but my Lord and my God, that's what he said to Jesus. That is huge. I think he was ready for that moment. When he saw the evidence that he had asked for, and by the way, it reminds me of Nathanael who said, how did you see me under the tree? That's the way John begins almost, right? And Thomas now realizes, yeah, Jesus was listening when I said what I said a week ago. And he knew what I was asking for. And he provided it here. So the last thing I would say he did right is when he saw the truth and he got the evidence he wanted, he acknowledged the truth in total submission. And when we're struggling with our doubts and we don't ignore them and we stay where we can get the answers and we work at it because we're uncomfortable and seasick because we have these doubts that have such significance in our life, and we finally get some answers, that's the way we ought to respond. This is huge. My Lord and my God. Now, did he get all his answers to those puzzling scriptural questions that he had? And those kind of fell into insignificance. They will work themselves out before the Son of God. You see that? I think we get all balled up in tiny issues when the central issue is really our faith in God. So, I would say this to us. I hope we're true searchers. And I'm going to define a searcher as someone who's constantly pushing the faith against his doubt or her doubt. Always pushing to widen the strength of our faith, to crowd out those doubts, to eliminate them if possible. Those are true searchers for truth. Here's some evidence. They're studying and investigating the crucial issues. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, on resurrection of the dead generally, he says this is of first importance, that Jesus died and rose again and saw and was seen by many witnesses. This is the way Paul begins that argument in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians. That's what's important. That is of first importance. Now, study everything else, but make sure that foundation is firm. And if it starts to be filled with doubts, go work on it some more, just like Thomas did. Put aside irrelevant or secondary issues. I hope your faith is not dependent on how all the animals got in the ark. Okay? If it is, go to Kentucky to that museum. No, I'm just, you understand if God can raise someone from the dead after what Jesus went through, I don't think getting animals on the ark is that big of an issue. Especially even compared to creating the world and other minor things like that. But put those aside. These are not the sources of your doubt. It's something else. These could be puzzling details, surface contradictions, what all other people on the earth believe, emotions that are pushing me one way or the other because of problems in my life, the imperfections of teachers and followers. Listen, do you think the New Testament has any information about the likely apostasy and hypocrisy and sinfulness and greediness and everything else, divisiveness of members of the church? Is there anything about that in the New Testament? The Apostle Paul that's almost every letter is about something like that. So let's not be surprised, but that's not the reason we have faith. It's not because of the perfection of the disciples. That's a distraction at the very best. Difficult life consequences. What I mean by that is, if I accept this, then I'm going to have to, fill in the blank. Give up my job, leave my inappropriate marriage. I'm going to have to stop this habit that I really like. These are consequences that are tough. That's not what determines truth or not. It's whether there's evidence or not. But it sometimes distracts us, an irrelevant or secondary issue. Okay, I think it's important that we feel uncomfortable when we're in doubt. We should be driven by urgency because of the importance of establishing faith. If there isn't a resurrection from the dead, then we're kind of all men most pitiable, is one of the things Paul says. We should eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we die, and that's the meaninglessness of the world we live in. Is that important to you? It should make us seasick if we start to have doubts about that kind of thing. I think we make opportunities to find truth, including, if you had one, a Sunday night service, right? But a Bible class. But there are tons of books, and there are actually Christians who have wrestled with the same doubts that you may be having, or the same life circumstances. If you're not talking to them, you're not being fair. You're not taking advantage of the things God has provided, the evidence He's put in your life to help you with that. And then I think, I love that Thomas says, look, if I see this, then I'll believe. I challenge you, if you're having doubts, to write down what that doubt is. Write it down so somebody else can read it and maybe help you with it. And maybe even write down, and if I got this information, that's all I need. That's what I need. Challenge yourself to think through it with that level of detail. And I would warn you, don't say, Jesus needs to appear to me directly, right? That's what Thomas expected, but that's not probably good on the list. But I think clarifying, articulating, verbalizing, writing something down, if you're really having a doubt, can't you explain those issues? What do you believe then? What do you not believe? And what is the evidence that you put on either side? Clarify that. And that is not, in my experience as an elder and even since, dealing with people who are, quote, struggling with doubts, that is not anywhere near the kind of behavior I've observed. It's usually a fading away to protect some kind of a lifestyle that they don't want to give up. And then the doubts are kind of a convenient reason that I don't have to say, well, I've denied the faith by my behavior. And be resolved to totally submit when we met these conditions. What do we know about Thomas? What happened to him? You know, there's some traditions that Thomas, Peter, and Paul went to Asia and Europe even, you know, with the gospel. There's a tradition that Thomas went to India. I don't know if you're aware of that. And there is some evidence in India of a heritage of a church that was established even in the first century. I think in Madras or somewhere. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out. And he was martyred there according to the tradition. May or may not be true. But I do know that he's mentioned one more time by John, and it's in the very next chapter. You remember Jesus told them to go before him into Galilee, that he would appear there. And you begin chapter 21. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, Sea of Galilee. And in this way, he showed himself. Look at how these names are listed. Simon, yeah, Peter. You know, he had some things to talk to Peter about. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Remember that incident there that's going to follow. But the second name is Thomas. Oh, by the way, called the twin. Again, John helping us out so we're not confused with something else. You know, I wonder, who was the twin? Where was he? I wonder what they called him. The other twin? You know? Who is the twin? Well, if you go back to chapter 20, and I'm throwing this out and I would not argue with anybody, but it's just an idea. Jesus finished by saying, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Looking at Thomas' personality, I'm a lot like that. I'm a pessimist. I like things to be literal. I like them to be organized. I don't like figurative language very much, right? I like to have things, my degrees are in math and physics, okay? I like to see equations that work out and prove a certain thing. I like that. I think I'm like Thomas in some way. And so when Jesus turns to Thomas and he says, yes, because you have seen me, you have believed. You know the rest of that is, I think, he's turning to Thomas's twin. And Thomas's twin didn't get to see him, did he? I think maybe we're Thomas's twin. And maybe there's some way in which we have the struggle with our doubts, with the testimony and all that. What Jesus went on to say is, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. Maybe that's the other twin. I know it's you and me, isn't it? I know it's you and me as we wrestle with our doubts. I'm done. Sorry, I went a little bit long.